Okay, welcome everyone. Hello everyone. Good morning to some of you. Good afternoon to others. And thank you so much for being here today. So first, I have to mention that this training is made possible by support of a grant awarded to the Office of Violence Against Women through the U.S. Department of Justice, also hosted by the ISU Gender Resource Center and the ISU Department of Anthropology and TRANScending Task Force. The views expressed in this webinar are those of the authors and do not necessarily express those of ISU or the U.S. Department of Justice. So I want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Dr. Samantha Blatt, and I'm assistant professor at Idaho State University, Department of Anthropology, and I'm your host today. So my expertise is in bioarchaeology of North America, forensic anthropology, and hard tissue histology, and I have consulted with the TRANScending Task Force since 2019. And I want to introduce you to the themes, purpose, and significance of our webinar today, and then, of course, introduce you to our panelists before we get started. So the registration for this event was really beyond what we expected, and we're really grateful for all the interest. And today we hope that these sessions will generate growing interest, research, and collaboration on the topic of gender identity as part of evidence used to identify a decedent from a forensic case. We have an audience that consists of forensic scholars, law enforcement, LGBTQ+ activists, community members and allies, gender studies scholars, social workers, and genetic genealogists. Invitation of a broad audience today was intentional, given the complexity of the issues of transgender and non-binary identification in forensic cases and the need for holistic, informed, and community-involved solutions. So this day-long webinar consists of sessions devoted to discussion of transgender and non-binary people in culture, historic, and forensic perspective. And it brings together anthropologists, genealogists discussing the limitations and barriers facing identification of gender and sex in forensic cases. So really, to get to the grit of the problem that spark this webinar, the homicide rate of transgender and non-binary individuals has been characterized by the American Medical Association as nothing less than an epidemic. In addition to the growing number of transgender victims, there have been 40 anti-trans bills across 25 different states in the US recently, which do nothing to derail the epidemic of violence against transgender people. During the 2020 Transgender Day of Remembrance, November 20th, 350 transgender people were reported murdered, suffocated, lynched, and burned alive across the world. The youngest last year was 15 years old. Not unusual, since the 81% of transgender homicide victims are under the age of 30. 11 trans people in the US have been murdered since 3/11/21, compared to 3 this time last year. Trans women are the most vulnerable, accounting for 98% of the murders, and Black and Latinx trans women and Two-Spirit Indigenous people are at most risk. This has risen each year, partially because of activism and reporting of these cases, but many go unreported or misreported due to variation in state and national laws regarding hate crimes, among other things, and these numbers are likely underestimated. The rise in transgender-focused violence brings to light the particular neglect and gap in knowledge of gender diverse people among forensic anthropologists and medical legal practitioners. Stigma and discrimination and a wide range of violence overlap with other axes of oppression prevalent in society, such as racism, sexism, misogyny, xenophobia, and anti-sex worker sentiment and discrimination. The pandemic has disproportionately hit the lives of LGBTQ+ people. Social changes brought on by COVID-19 have impacted the gendered violence rates and those already living in the margins. Individuals who have been considered to be non-conformative to gender are an overrepresented forensic population due to the disproportionate resources for case resolution and misunderstanding or inability to read contextual clues related to gender identity. This disparity has resulted in forensic cold cases involving transgender and non-binary decedents. While forensic anthropologists are trained to estimate assigned biological sex, male or female, as a product of chromosomal pairing from skeletal markers, they cannot estimate gender from the skeleton. Therefore, it is necessary to decentralize the heteronormative narrative of biological sex in order to realize means of social justice for transgender and non-binary decedents. The combined DNA and historical investigations of the new field of forensic genetic genealogy combined with forensic anthropology has had recent success in identifying transgender victims and may elevate the value of considering gender identity as part of the forensic identification. In 2019, Los Angeles County became the first jurisdiction in the nation to start training medical examiners and coroners to investigate the deaths of LGBTQ decedents. And they required asking gender affirming questions of surviving family and friends and collecting mortality data in connection to gender identity and sexual orientation. The topics covered in this webinar have been in part influenced by the heteronormative history of forensic anthropology, which, despite common use of methods which score skeletal traits on a scale or continuum, has limited sex to a binary, John and Jane Doe, male, female, or indeterminate. Currently, forensic anthropology is critically self-examining the limitations and consequences of standardizing sex as a binary, as well as other topics related to ancestry and race estimation in the skeleton. The field has also been influenced by current techniques in case resolution using forensic genetic genealogy. Recent forensic anthropology and clinical research has also begun to examine the skeletal impact of gender affirmation surgery, common or exclusive implants used in gender affirmation surgery, and long-term hormone treatments. This webinar will be emphasizing, through a series of strategies discussed, that gender identity does not require medical treatment. Medical treatment is not an option because of cost or legislation, or not sought by many people. And reliance on evidence of medical treatment in the skeleton would further marginalize transgender, non-binary, and intersex populations with a history of forced medical treatments and ignore 75% of trans without surgery and 50% who do not undergo hormone therapy. So the panelists today will focus discussion on other informed strategies and resources, which also brings multidisciplinary awareness to the recently proclaimed International Transgender Day of Visibility, which was this last Wednesday. So on this front, very timely to this webinar, I thought I should point out the 2021 work of Tallman, Kinzer, and Plemons, who cite the TransDoe Task Force and the work of our panelists here today. They published a paper which results with the results of having surveyed forensic anthropologists for the perceptions and experiences with transgender cases. And they found that nearly 30% of forensic anthropologists surveyed had participated in a case involving a transgender individual. Yet the vast majority, about 75%, were unfamiliar with gender affirming surgeries. And so this study also shows that 42% of forensic anthropologists surveyed agreed that sex is binary, but that 39% agreed that gender should be included in reports. Overall, over 95% of respondents who were forensic anthropologists supported further research methodologically. So this quote on the slide from one of the forensic anthropologist respondents in this Tallman et al. Study really sticks out particularly to me in the problem. And so we hope that the webinar today will further spark that support, interest, and awareness. And we will, of course, address many of the terms associated with gender in our first talks, as well as we will be providing a glossary later on. So now I'd like to briefly introduce to you our panelists. Several of the sessions today will be presented by Anthony Redgrave and Lee Bingham Redgrave, who are co-founders of the TransDoe Task Force, which we'll learn a lot about today, and Redgrave Research, and have participated in the closure of about 24 cases. And the Redgraves are forensic genetic genealogists who participate in forensic cases involving unknown, unidentified skeletal remains. They will provide an overview of transgender individuals through time and a tutorial on genetic genealogy with case studies. Many of our moderators behind the scenes today are actually volunteers and students and interns of the TransDoe Task Force. And Anthony and Lee will head session 1, 2, and 6, giving everyone an overview of forensic genetic genealogy and some of those successful cases. Next, we have Jesse Veltstra, who will be speaking in sessions 3 and 7 about the challenges in the numbers and introducing the use of LAMP as a resource for trans and non-binary cold cases. And she's a volunteer with the TransDoe Task Force, administers the LAMP databank, which you will hear about today. And she's a forensic genetic genealogist as well with Redgrave Research. Then we have Taylor Flaherty, who is a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She specializes in forensic anthropology and hormone therapy impact on skeletal sex indicators. and she will be speaking in session 5 with Amy and Mari about the current research approaches to forensic casework. Dr. Amy Michael is a lecturer at University of New Hampshire in the Department of Anthropology. She also has appointments in Justice Studies and Women's and Gender Studies. She's been working with TRANSdo Task Force since 2019 and specializes in forensic anthropology, bioarchaeology and central beliefs, and histological methods. Currently, she has co-authored multiple articles and conference presentations emphasizing the intersecting work to be done between anthropologists and forensic genetic genealogists. And then finally, we have Dr. Mari Isa, an assistant professor of anthropology and forensic anthropology specialist at Texas Tech University and a TRANSdo Task Force ally. And both Amy and Mari, along with myself, will speak in session 4, 5, and 7 to give an overview of sex estimation and some of the research and the skeletal limitations of sex estimation. All right, so finally, for some housekeeping, you should feel free to jump in and out of this webinar as your time permits throughout the day. The webinar sessions are being recorded and will be available at a later date, and you'll get some information in the chat about that. The sessions are also being live streamed. Though we encourage you to chat with other attendees and make comments in the chat feature, please do not post questions you have for the panelists in the chat. Please post questions for the panelists in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen throughout the sessions. Your questions will be moderated and given an allotted time at the end of each session to be answered live by the panelists. Panelists and moderators may also type responses throughout your sessions. And if you do not want your question answered live, you'll have to yourself click a button that says you want it to be answered privately in order for us to do that. And similarly with chat will be monitored, and we may add links and other resources throughout the day with that. Please maintain, of course, a respectful and appropriate behavior in the chat towards each other and towards the panelists. We wanted this event to be open to multiple audiences, but moderators do reserve the right to remove any disruptive participants. As you have probably already noticed, all attendees will be muted and have their cameras automatically off during this webinar, but you will be able to see all of the panelists. We have chosen to do this to conserve bandwidth, but also for creating a general environment of safety for everyone as well. And at the end of the day, stay tuned because we will have some swag giveaways for completing our post-event survey, which I'll show you images of in a moment. So you will get an email later on, and they'll be posted in the chat what that link is for the survey afterwards. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We'll get started. This is some of the swag that you could possibly win. And I would first like to introduce in our first session our panelists Anthony and Lee Redgrave to begin session 1 to discuss overrepresentation of marginalized groups in forensic cases. And Anthony will also be hosting session 2 at 11 to talk about transgender, non-binary and intersex history and culture. So Anthony, I will now turn this over to you.
Okay, so hello, we are Anthony and Lee, and thanks for coming. We already did our intro, so thank you to ISU for hosting us and sponsoring this event. And thank you for just being willing to show up. So Sam did a pretty awesome job introducing us as individuals and as our group, the TRANSdo Task Force. So TRANSdo Task Force was created to research cold cases in which the subject may have been transgender or gender variant. We also advise and educate the public, media, and law enforcement regarding the needs and sensitive differences between transdo cases and other do cases. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. And this is recorded, even if the YouTube link didn't work first, it's working now. And we'll have the hard copy recordings up soon. Take notes, ask us questions via email if you're watching the recording. So
there's also a Q&A box if you're in the Zoom, which is the ideal place to put your question if you want it to float to the top.
Yes. So we also reach out to and assist law enforcement departments, medical examiners, and forensic anthropologists with getting their cases submitted for forensic genealogy. Forensic genealogy is an excellent mediator of a lot of the issues that we're talking about today. because you know how people say DNA don't lie. You know, that'll help you a lot to figure out who you're looking for. And then we have the added step of going to find someone's chosen name after we find their dead name. We're going to talk a lot about that today too.
Right. And that's not to say that DNA can tell you somebody's gender.
Nope.
It can't, but it can tell you somebody's identity. And through learning who that person is, you can learn about their gender identity and be able to represent them accurately in memoriam.
Mm-hmm. So the main thing that we're going to talk about today is why it's important to address trans and non-binary and intersex people as a forensically significant population. The obvious answer is that because they're people and all people matter. But what we also want to point out is that there's so many of us that we're not outliers. We are a population and we're worth looking at and caring for. According to a 2016 study by the Williams Institute of UCLA, 1.4 million adults identified as transgender in the United States. That's comprised of 0.7 adults between the ages of 18 and 24 and 0.5% adults of ages 65 and older of the entire population of the US are estimated to identify as transgender based on this study. That's a lot of people. So transgender people also experience disproportionately high rates of fatal violence, and the average age of forensically significant premature deaths, such as violence, suicide, or unknown cause, of a transgender person in the United States is significantly lower than what it is in other parts of the world. So that blue bar at the top is the global numbers. This is all pulled from the Transgender Day of Remembrance website. You can get some excellent analytics off this site. So this is how we made this chart. So you can see that little red bar, a lot shorter. Premature death of any kind, around 31 and a half globally. It's around 30. The suicide rate of trans people in the US is startling, and that absolutely needs to be addressed as very important. So you'll see this slide more than once today. This is going to be repeated in a number of presentations. The number of people, the average percentage of people who are born intersex, meaning that they don't cleanly fit into the male or female box according to their chromosomes or their sex characteristics, are around 1% and 2%. And that's as frequent as a person being born with red hair. There are a lot of different presentations of being intersex, just like there's lots of different presentations of people being redhead. And we'll talk about this more later, but by this statistic, it's actually more likely for a person to be born intersex, whether they know it or not, than it is for a person to identify as transgender.
And there's a lot of intersex people who do not know that they are intersex ever. You may never know that unless you have some medical reason that causes you to find out. Honestly, in Anthony's case, you didn't find out for sure until you
was
were
like in my mid-20s.
Yeah. So, and his medical records were destroyed. So, it's definitely a bit of a startling statistic at first, but it's true. So yeah,
you get to talk about my skeleton.
If Anthony was to become lost in the woods and become an unidentified decedent, would he be able to be identified? And how would people classify his skeleton, his skeletal remains? We don't know. This is a question that we started asking ourselves when we started doing forensic genetic genealogy cases. We started because we started learning about DNA in order to learn more about intersex conditions and to understand Anthony's DNA better, because he was doing his own genealogy puzzles with genetic genealogy, and his DNA was doing things we wanted to understand better. So it was kind of a progression to get here. But early on, we had a conversation that was just, what would happen if you were unidentified? How would you be classified? We don't know. For a number of reasons, we don't know. And this is kind of the question that led us to wonder if we could find any trans cases that needed to be worked on, that were cold cases that nobody was talking about. And this was the very beginnings of the TRANSDO task force being formed, was kind of this question.
So that's a large portion of what led us to this. And so just to talk a little bit about myself and my state of being, I'm intersex and transgender, and I have a number of vital records that have changed over the course of my life. I've had my name changed, I've had my gender marker changed on my birth certificate, and I've had my birth certificate amended. So I sort of have two birth certificates that would be on record.
But one of them wouldn't be available. See, if genealogists in the future were trying to identify you via genetic genealogy, they wouldn't maybe be able to find that. Some of those records wouldn't be available to them because certain records are not available to genealogists until well past the time that the record is made.
Yeah. So, and also we don't know what my skeleton looks like. It's thankfully still inside my body right now, and I'm going to keep it that way for as long as I can. But you know, what checkbox would an investigator tick if they looked at me? Like, as Sam introduced, sex estimation is on a spectrum. But when it comes down to the level of the criminal investigation, the estimation part has a tendency to fall off. So we don't know what checkbox an investigator would tick. Would around 50% of the population immediately get ruled out? I don't know. And if I was reported missing, how would I be reported missing? Would I be reported missing as male or female, depending on who reported me missing? What would the investigator of my missing persons case do? And would it be the same checkbox as what was checked if I was found as an unidentified skeleton? We don't know. So, missing to unidentified databases in general do not compare across sex categories. So, what would happen if a missing person is reported as a gender that does not align with their sex estimation, like what might have happened with hypothetical Anthony skeleton? What would happen if an unidentified decedent had an ambiguous sex estimation and the agency has to pick one? Older databases default ambiguous unidentified decedents to male, and non-binary categories that do exist are often disregarded or misused. So sex categories in databases are almost always binary. There's not a right-in field, and if there's an other or unknown, it's not always used or not always used appropriately. So bias and dangerous assumptions and failure to provide, to file reports often cause investigations to deprioritize trans and gender variant cases. So for example, if a missing person isn't reported missing by their family because they were kicked out, or if a missing persons report was not filed because it was reported by chosen family and friends, sometimes those get disregarded, almost always they do.
Yeah, historically speaking, if somebody's partnership wasn't recognized, you just be viewed as a roommate, and you can't make a police report necessarily on a missing roommate. I mean, you can report it, but they might not file a missing persons report unless the family files that.
And if a missing persons report was not taken seriously by an investigator because of that missing person being what is called a high-risk lifestyle, this is the problem that has been the case for many decades of if a person is trans or wearing clothing that is culturally coded to something other than their assigned sex, they're automatically deemed a high-risk lifestyle individual because that is often equated to sex work, which is obviously not always the case. And if it is, it does not mean they are not priority. So how many John and Jane Does are unidentified because of these reasons? Probably a lot. We're still getting the numbers because this has not been addressed before we came here. Do you want to go over cases?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Live Oak Doe was one of the first cases that TransDO Task Force began researching. They were someone who was found in Texas in the early 80s. They were still alive when they were found and transported to the hospital where they died. And so the DNA Doe Project was able to get this case and has recently announced that it was resolved, that they were able to find this person's identification via forensic genetic genealogy. And this is the second successful case that we've researched and gotten into the hands of genealogists that has resulted in an identification. And this was the first successful case that we had. This was also one of the earlier cases that we researched. This was a case that Anthony and I were team leaders on at the DNA Doe Project before we solved this a couple of months before we left.
Mm-hmm.
So we're no longer with the DNA Doe Project, and TransDO Task Force is a totally separate project. But at the time that this case was being worked, we were with the DNA Doe Project, and we were able to assist with the efforts of the genealogy team, which was an amazing team. We constructed a very trans savvy team, and people who we wanted on the team who weren't trans savvy yet. We gave them our little 101 and got everybody up to speed, because we didn't know when we began researching this person what we were going to find. We didn't know if this was a trans person or if this was a person who was just, cross-dressing for the day. We don't know until we find out more about them. So we chose to go ahead with just using they, them pronouns because of not knowing what this person's identity was. And that's just how we operated while we were doing our casework. So this is a case where somebody was clearly a victim of a classic overkill of what we see in trans women frequently, is that there are multiple methods used to kill someone, far more than would be needed to be a fatal attack. And this is definitely an example of a case like that, where it was just way too many things were done to this person for it to not be a hate crime. And it was a case that shouldn't have stayed cold. And so when the DNA Doe Project reached out to the agency handling this case, we were very happy that they were very receptive. They were very excited that there was an option to move forward with bringing this case back to life and working on it again. And now we're still waiting on the announcement of Pillar Point Doe's actual name, because they're actually able to continue their homicide investigation in search of the perpetrator. Because once you have an identification, even if it's a 40-year-old case, you can start investigating what happened to that person more effectively. And this is Julie Doe. Julie Doe's case is still in progress at the DNA Doe Project. She was a 1988 Florida homicide victim, and her case is fascinating because she was originally estimated to be female. She was entered into the system as a Jane Doe, and it wasn't until 2014 when they pulled her DNA profile and found a Y chromosome that they went, oh, this is a trans woman. And so they, corrected it to John Doe in the database. But how does that actually help her case? We don't know, because if she was ever reported as a missing person, we do not know if she was reported before or after her transition. She could have been reported as a missing person as a male or as a female. And either way, she may not have been matched up in the database for that reason. So it was definitely important to proceed with DNA for her identification, because the databases aren't going to fill in that gap.
So because of these gaps in comparison in standard forensic databases, we've created something called the LAMP database, the LGBTQ+ Accountability for Missing and Murdered Persons database. And Jesse will be talking more about this in session 3. we've created our own lists of unidentified people who may have been trans or gender variant. And we also maintain a list of missing persons that list is only visible to people who are authorized to see it in order to reduce harm to those missing persons, because who knows why they're missing. And so we're able to actually compare those without being ruled an automatic exclusion because of a sex marker, and to compare other data points like contextual clues to indicate other aspects of lifestyle. This also includes some other sexual minorities as well. And we feel like that's important to include because of the deprioritization of supposed high-risk lifestyle. And so if you'd like to learn about this, you can go to the website that's listed here, and Jesse will talk about it more in session 3 and give you a breakdown of how it works. That's the end of our slide deck for this session, and we actually have plenty of time to take questions. So I'm going to take a look at the chat and see what we have. It looks like people have already answered some questions in the chat for us. Does anyone have any other questions for us that we could answer?
Let's see.
And if you do, again, just as a reminder, if you have questions, you can put those in the Q&A feature instead of the chat.
Okay. What sorts of credentials do you need to become involved? Well, it's a really multidisciplinary field. So the main thing is to have the desire to do so and to find ways to employ what you already have. We're doing a lot of use what you know. That's why we have people who are anthropologists, criminal justice professionals, and
we draw on a lot of people as consultants. If you have a professional field that you work in that you feel you could lend some assistance through what you already do. We do have consultants that work with us. In terms of forensic genetic genealogy, to actually work on the genealogy part of the cases, that's a whole other
that's a whole other session.
Whole other question.
Come to session 6.
Yeah, session 6. We have a training program that is at fg4le.com, number 4. And that is probably the most thorough training program for forensic genetic genealogy that's available right now. And so we have that feed into an internship program, and some of our interns are able to work on genealogy cases directly with us. Let's see, there's questions popping up.
So when did you discover your interest in forensic genealogy? So that is a long and convoluted story that we're more than happy to answer. So
I was adopted.
Yeah, Lee was adopted, and I didn't know who my birth father was other than a name and a date on the back of a photo.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's kind of like how we got interested in genealogy. And then how we got into DNA was largely by trying to find out stuff about Anthony's family and his being intersex and how that affects his DNA profile. And then how we got into applying that to forensic cases was kind of, by being part of the trans community and the LGBT community, we've had a number of friends have violent deaths. And one of our friends found out about the DNA Dope Project before they formed, before they actually incorporated as a nonprofit even, and suggested that we write directly to Colleen Fitzpatrick and apply to volunteer to work with them. And so we did, because it seemed like a natural way to follow our previous experience and also address some of that frustration and grief that we carry around as members of the community. What can we do about these things that are happening to our friends? So this is our answer to our own question of what can we do about these things that are happening to our friends.
Yeah. That's not the mouse, that's my clicker.
There's a typo in your email.
Oh no. Where's the typo in my email?
Missed an E. It's okay.
Oh, we're not Redgrave Research.
That's
We're
all right.
Redgrave Research. What kind of data is needed for faster identification, or have most cases taken some time? The data we need is for people to upload their DNA to GEDmatch
And
with a
opt-in.
tree attached and opt into law enforcement matching.
That's ideal.
Yes.
The more data points we have as genetic genealogists, the easier we can construct effective trees and triangulate the location of the person we're looking for.
Mhm.
So definitely, we have seen that one person's, ancestry test that they got as a present from somebody be the key to solving a case. Just that one upload comes in and like, oh, this is the key piece that we needed to figure this out.
That does happen.
So,
and sometimes it's not a high match. Sometimes it's one that's farther down. You'll learn more about our techniques later, and we'll talk about that. The other thing that would lead to faster identification would be try to report people missing, even if they're a friend, or get them into the LAMP database so that we can compare them. Maybe it won't have to go all the way to forensic genetic genealogy. Maybe we'll be able to actually do that before we have to do that. Ideally, that should be the last line of defense. So are there any cases where discovering the birth gender of someone has assisted the case? First off, birth sex, gender is a social construct. Birth sex or assigned sex at birth is what we use for the terminology. There has not been that at any point yet, but there has been a case where an individual was given a sex estimation of female when they were actually male.
And we've seen that a couple of times.
That has happened a number of times. Cisgender people occasionally get misgendered in databases as well because of the trouble of sex estimations. And we're going to talk about that later. The anthropologists are going to talk about that in their session quite a bit. What is the primary resources such as mental health for victims or just group trans members in general? Well, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Honestly, there's not fantastic resources for victims, for families of victims or surviving victims. There's not sufficient resources, and the resources that are there are wonderful, but they're not always easy to find. There's not a kind of streamlined way to end up at the resources that are available if you find yourself in that situation. There's not like nobody gives you a how to survive this weird thing that's happening to you guide. Often the law enforcement deals with it constantly. So it's an everyday event. Violence is an everyday event for them. They don't always think to ask the victims' families, do you need resources? Ask them, do you have mental health support? That's not always a thing.
That is one thing that we intend to actually provide through the Transdo Task Force as a way to help people come together as a community after we do reach an ID, because chosen family matters. And sometimes it really does matter more. And so we'll get there, but there's really not very good victim support resources. I mean, there's Facebook groups, but that only does so much.
And I'm also going to say that Jessie, our presenter for session 3, is going to be another person who can address that question.
Yeah.
She's been doing victim family advocacy work for quite a number of years.
Yeah. Do you tend to default to they, them pronouns in cases where you're unsure of the decedent's gender identity? Yes, we always default to they, them pronouns for any case in our list of potentially trans or gender variant cases. And we only use gendered pronouns when there's very clear evidence to support that a person was actually transgender, such as the case of Julie Doe, where this was obviously a transgender woman.
I think that's the only case we've found so far where it's been clear enough for us to feel comfortable assuming a gender identity.
Yeah.
Because in 1988, in order to have had the surgeries that she had, she would have had to have adhered to certain standards to receive that. And that would include affirming a solid female gender identity. So we can know that because of historical clues. But I think that's the only case where we know for sure that anyone has had a surgical medical transition in a case of an unidentified decedent. Most of the time it's that they're in some gray area and people haven't known what to do with them. So they just have gone by the wayside.
Yeah.
So, and you see me saying they, because it's, we just don't want to assume, we don't know. We need to know more.
Yeah, misgendering or assuming produces bias. Do you have any medical examiners that work with the Transdo task force, or are they only consultants? Do medical examiners refer the cases to your team? We have had medical examiners refer cases to us, and we have also spoken with medical examiners and collaborated on research. We are the Transdo task force is a sort of a grassroots project for now. We're working on pursuing nonprofit status, so we don't have anybody working with us. We're all collaborating and consulting. So I think that answers that.
Technically, it's us right now.
Yeah. All of us who are here. That's us.
Well, I mean us, as in you and I. Technically, Anthony and I are the owners of the Transdo task force right now, until we're able to incorporate, at which point we'll name board members. So like incorporate separately. Right now we're incorporated under our Redgrave research umbrella. So where we also have our training course. So, but we are going to kind of section off Transdo task force and pursue nonprofit status. And at that point we will name board members, and we want to have a balanced board of interdisciplinary folks.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, my soundbar keeps going off. Thank you for all that you do. Have you interacted with the court system, such as being an expert witness? If so, how is your experience? We have not been expert witnesses as yet. We hope to be considered as such if the issue ever comes up, and I will gladly do so if the need arises. Do you mainly seek out cases, or do you ever have people reach out to you seeking help with dealing with this type of case? We usually seek out cases, but we have had more and more people come to us with cases from departments. It's starting to happen now that people know that we're here. And
people knowing we're here is a big deal.
Yeah, this is going to help a lot of people know that we're here. So we're going to hopefully start seeing a lot more of that. What we want is for people to reach out and consider that there is a problem, because we do a lot of pointing out that there is a problem and here is the solution. But if people come to us seeking that solution, it would be much better. I'm just going to keep going until we run out of time. We've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, chromosome situation. How do folks get tested to see what their chromosome situation is? And how might they attach that to some vital record? Oh, interesting.
Hey, that's awesome.
To attach that to some vital record to be useful in the event of death. I think that's a very good question.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why we kind of DIY'd and hacked Anthony's genome ourselves is because he had inconclusive karyotyping. So karyotyping is what you need to find out what your chromosomal situation is. And Anthony's chromosomal situation is too complicated for basic karyotyping to figure out.
Yeah, what they told me was that I would have to get a more expensive test that my health insurance was not going to pay for. So what I ended up doing was actually pursuing whole genome sequencing for myself, which I'm actually still learning how to interpret for myself. Because if I have something like mosaicism or something, I wouldn't really know how to interpret that. So I'm actually probably going to end up talking to a bioinformatics friend about that at some point.
Or taking a bioinformatics course yourself.
Bioinformatics class. DIYing it is usually our way to go. So attaching it so that it would be useful in the event of death. If you do it through your healthcare provider and it ends up in your health record, that would be one way to do that.
Yeah, but genealogists wouldn't be able to see that.
Exactly.
So that's an interesting question. So here's what this is a little nugget I like to give people. If there's something that you want people to know about after you die, if you go on to familysearch.org, it's a free genealogy website. You can make yourself your own profile and put in your own information. And since you're a living person, it's private. Other people won't be able to see what you're putting in. You can leave whatever you want there on your own profile. And when you die and someone indexes your death record and marks you as deceased, that will become visible and people will be able to see whatever you left there. You can leave video messages, you can leave audio messages, you can leave pictures, you can leave stories, and you can leave whatever record you want. If you want to leave a medical record that you want people to know about when you die, you can do that. That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think we'll just go through a couple more questions
and
then
more.
Yeah, looks like
we'll
you have about
answer
2 more
other.
minutes.
I think our overflow of questions, I'm not sure what we're doing with our overflow questions. We're answering an email maybe.
Yeah, we're gonna be able to save a list of the questions and respond to them. We can probably save the answers to the questions in our website page.
Yep, and we can also answer some in text during the break in between.
Yeah.
Let's just answer one more question,
let's
and then
take this one.
we can take some more. We'll answer some more in text during the break.
Okay, so what are the biggest tools that you use for forensic DNA work? For example, Collins, leads, etc. That is going to be answered in session 6. We have a lot of tools that we use, and we'll show you some of them then. That was an easy question to answer. Come back at session 6, and you can learn all about it.
Yeah, but also I can give it easy answer. The thing that Anthony uses the most is DNA Painter.
DNA Painter. We love DNA Painter.
It's the new Tetris.
It is the new Tetris. I don't play video games anymore. We can probably do one more.
Okay.
Okay. Have you had any struggles, either ethical or personal, with working with law enforcement? Oh, yeah. Due to the historically contentious relationship they have with the LGBTQ plus community. I actually had a very interesting conversation with my assistant dissertation advisor about code switching. So the way that you talk to your family and friends is different than the way that you talk to professionals in other fields. And you actually have to change the way that you speak to people. One thing that we've had to do a lot in our field is spend a lot of time talking to people who we know for a fact that underneath of their professional exterior, they're not going to be people that we want to be friends with, but we have to be professionals. For example, I know that there's a lot of people that I've worked with who are probably Republicans, and that's okay. I have to be okay with that.
The thing is, we're asking law enforcement to look at how things have been done in the past, and we're asking them to take the opportunity that we're giving them to find a solution on how to reduce harm and move forward doing things in a better way. And when you're coming to somebody asking them to do something, you don't just want to go complaining about the problem. You want to offer the solution. So that's what we try to focus on, is offering the solution rather than railing them on the problem.
Yeah, and the thing that we have in common, which is wanting to help people and get people identified.
Exactly. So we think that that's it's something that is definitely a longer conversation that we would love to have. There's a little bit of that conversation in one of our Pride Week videos from last year.
It's on our Facebook if you want to find it. So I think we're going to cut it here, and we'll answer the rest of these questions either during the break or on our site afterwards. So we will see you again in 10 minutes.
Yep.
And I'm going to mute here, and we'll archive this video. This one had a bit of an issue, so we'll get the recording from whoever was recording it live and upload that later. But the YouTube link, if anybody needs it, it's going to be the same YouTube link during the day. I'm not going to mess with it because it's working now. All right, we'll see you in 10.